The problem of the too-short bed made King Henry realize that having a standard measure for distance would be just as important as having a standard measure for time. The kingdom could not go on using each man's own foot or hand to measure, because each man had a different sized foot. So the confusions, like what happened with the bed, would be common if he didn't come up with a solution. King Henry sent the carpenter back to his workshop with instructions to make the bed 2 feet, by the carpenter's measure, longer. Then he went to the Queen to discuss what to do about the problem of measurements. Queen Adeliza, whom he found in the stables just finishing her morning ride, laughed when the king described the problem to her. "Don't you see," she said, "you counsel the people with this same problem all the time. The tailors can't agree on the length of a yard of fabric. The farmers claim you have given a larger share of land to one than another. The shepherds claim their skeins of yarn are the same length, yet some have enough yarn for a shawl, while others can barely make a hat. Isn't this the problem the council in Vinland was gathered to discuss?" The king nodded, looking thoughtful. "You are absolutely right, my dear. But the council takes so long to discuss and decide. Perhaps we can help by taking on this matter ourselves." Later that day, King Henry met with his ministers and proposed the project of creating standard measurement. They all agreed that this was an urgent matter and should be undertaken immediately. One minister proposed an idea. "We could take the measure of the king's foot and make sticks of that length that all the people could use to measure," he said. Around the table, heads nodded in agreement. "No," said King Henry. "The measure should come from those who use it in their day-to-day work." The ministers saw the wisdom in the king's words. "But whose foot shall we use?" asked one of them. Then all of the king's court was abuzz with conversation, trying to decide if the best foot to use was the carpenters, the builders, the farmers, or the rope makers. "Why not use all the feet?" shouted one minister, who had been quiet until now. The room became quiet. "How could we use all of their feet?" many of the ministers asked. The king was intrigued to know how such a thing was possible. The minister had a solution. "We will take the measure of many feet in the kingdom and then find the most common foot, the average foot." "Very well," said the king. "Tomorrow after church, we will take the feet of 12 men." The next day, when the service had ended, the king and his men rose and went outside, followed by many of the women of the village and the children. But all the men stayed inside the church, as though they were glued to their pants by the wooden seats. They whispered among themselves with worried looks on their faces. "Charles, the scullery boy, heard the king say that he was going to take the feet of 12 men today," they whispered to one another. "Why does the king want to cut off our feet?" said Big William. Carlson and Hansen, usually unfriendly to one another, suddenly found friendship. "I will help you take care of your land," sobbed Carlson, "if the king takes my feet." "And I shall do the same for you, my friend, if the king chooses to take my feet," whimpered Hansen. The king and his ministers waited patiently outside the church. Finally, he had to send in soldiers to force the men of the town out of the doors of the church into the courtyard. "Take the first 12 men," the king ordered. Carlson and Hansen were both chosen and immediately began to sob on one another's shoulders. Big William was chosen as well as James the baker. Big William's mouth dropped like a sad puppy. 12 men were lined up and then ordered to remove their boots. Carlson and Hansen began to tremble, and when the knights drew their swords, both men began to wail with tears streaming down their faces. The king was perplexed by their outlandish behavior, but ordered his knights to continue. Hansen and Carlson closed their eyes. Big William turned his head to face away. The knights knelt down before the men and placed their swords against the bare feet of the 12 men. Carlson began to whimper loudly. Then the knight made a small mark upon his sword, each the length of a man's foot next to it. "God bless you, good men," said the king, and strode away.